Today's sermon is by Meg Barnhouse. It's entitled Two Parables of the Beloved Community. Those of you who have tolerated me talking about Meg Barnhouse, she's the pastor of Austin First UU, which is what Doug and I consider our second UU home. It used to be our first UU home, and we used to travel to Austin almost every other weekend when we were able to. But in the meantime, we all know that UUFHC is our home, and we're happy to be here. But sometimes Meg has a way of saying things, and she says them so well that I could never come up with it. So in today's sermon, she discusses, I think, what most of us are feeling, and it's timely. It's timely for what's happening this week and what has happened in these last few years. So I shall begin with two parables of the beloved community. In the Jewish faith story, the Hebrew people, descendants of Abraham and Sarah, had been enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. Think about being, this is me talking, think about being enslaved for 400 years when we feel like we've been enslaved for 4 years. Moses, the liberator, said to the Pharaoh, "Let my people go." The Pharaoh was reluctant, since he needed the labor of the people to build his economy. Then came the plagues. The water turned to blood, and no one could drink it. Frogs infested the land, then the flies did. Then all the cattle got sick, then the people got boils. Hail came, then locusts. Then the skies turned dark, so you couldn't even see your hand in front of your face. The last plague was that the firstborn children of all Egyptians died overnight. After the final plague, the Pharaoh said he would let Moses' people go. The Hebrew people were told to make unleavened bread, which we now know as matzo bread, a bread with no yeast, made only of flour, olive oil, water, and salt. This was fast and simple bread to make, and a person could live on it for a short time. You can mix grain and water together and live on paste for a little while, but you will soon die. If, however, you give the flour and water time, if you mix it together and set it on a counter in your kitchen, after a few days, it will start to bubble. I don't know which prehistoric person saw the grain and water porridge bubbling in a bowl in the corner and thought, I'm going to bake that in the fire. But they did. And they were the first bakers of bread. Anthropologists are divided about whether the first person to see the bubbling said, I'm going to bake that, or whether they said, I'm going to drink that. You have the bread before beer scientists, then you have the beer before bread scientists. If you let that flour and water paste start to take its time, that is, if you don't have to run away from the pursuing armies of Egypt, then you have leavened bread. And leavened or yeasted bread can sustain your life indefinitely. Where does the yeast come from? It's wild. It's in the air. Yeast is a fungus that floats in the biosphere. If you give it time, it will find your flour and water and start to break down the starches in the mixture, forming sugar. This is fermentation. When the yeast breaks down the cell walls of the starch, it gives off carbon dioxide, which makes the bubbles that create the holes that you see when you tear open a piece of bread. The readings this morning were a pair of parables attributed by the author to Rabbi Jesus. He was describing the kingdom of heaven, which we could translate as the beloved community. The beloved community is like a mustard seed, which a gardener planted. It grew and became a tree, and the birds perched on its branches. It's like yeast that a baker took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it all worked itself through the dough. Something that starts small can have a large effect. Helping build the beloved community doesn't have to be enormous, doesn't have to be sweeping actions, but small ones. Persistent, breaking down the walls of apathy and ignorance in order to create something that will nourish souls and transform lives. In the series Cooked on Netflix, botanist Michael Pollan talks about bread, how it was one of humanity's first foods, how bread or beer was the reason humans changed from being nomadic hunters to being farmers of wheat and other grains. To plant and have a harvest, people have to stay in one place for a period of time. Staying in one place means you will probably build dwellings that can last for at least a year. It may mean that you will have to defend your harvest from those who didn't plant it, but who may want it for themselves. Staying in one place means that when your people die, you will probably make one place where you bury their bodies. And you may develop some rituals, some ceremonies to render those burials sacred. When you have beer and bread, thanks to the wild yeast in the air of your place, you have conviviality, feasting, you survive, and you have nourishment and intoxication. Yay. Bread is the staff of life, a metaphor for a thing you need every day. In the Cook series, you see a boy, maybe 10 years old in Morocco, picking up the tray on which are the loaves his mother has kneaded and shaped for that morning. He takes them to the neighborhood baker whose house has the only oven. The baker bakes the loaves all day. The flour comes in from all over the world, Ukraine, Germany, France, because Morocco can't grow enough grain to make the bread eaten by all its people. Bread is the spoon that they scoop up the dinner. Bread is the plate. Meg states that her mother, who was raised in what is now Pakistan, would wash dishes muttering grumpily about the wastefulness of having to buy, store, and wash plates, when in India, she'd say, the plate is the bread, and when you are finished with the meal, the plate is gone. In some cultures, it is an offense to take a knife to bread. It wants to be handled, torn, to have the shape of a human action instead of a metal tool. When you have kneaded bread and it has become smooth and stretchy and then it rises, it has much the same feel to your hands as a human body, as if it were a baby, smooth under your hands. It feels as if it could be part of you and you part of it. Here is what I want you to remember. The beloved community is like yeast. You don't have to change everything at once. This is true within us and our communities. When I was in the seminary, Meg says, the women started calling God she. It was like a tiny seed that grew and changed everything, giving the birds of our lived experience a place to rest. The idea was like yeast that started bubbling, and soon we were all rising. Have you ever heard or seen something that seemed small at first, but changed the way you saw things? Another thing that changed me, she says, was when I followed the suggestion that watching TV or movies, I switched the genders of the people involved. Another seed is reversing the ethnicity of people you see. On Facebook, there was a meme with a row of Asian women laughing on their phones, having pedicures done by white women. And I think, and this is me speaking, I think this is the concept of Hamilton. And also there is a new show on Netflix where the characters are changed by ethnicities. It's very interesting. I wish I could remember the name. Back to the sermon. Tiny things can start big things in the culture. Greta Thunberg began her climate change activism sitting in the front of the Swedish Parliament building in August of 2018. How far have things come from there? Young climate change activists have been the yeast that leavens an enormous amount of flour. And we're all rising. People, ideas, songs can be yeast, a small beginning that changes everything. When 10% of a group begin to talk about something, people shrug them off as fringe folks, liberals. When 20% of people talk about something, people begin to notice, and it feels like everyone is talking about it. When 30% of people are on the bus, talking about the idea, it feels like a movement. When you have 40%, you can win over the rest of people easily. Now, this is what Meg has to say. And at this point, this is me. I think most of us agree that these last 4 years have been absolutely horrible. They're troublesome, and people have shown the worst in themselves. I think that even for the other side, the right wing, they feel that even we liberal-minded people are horrible. Because quite frankly, I know I have become defensive when I hear nonsense, when I hear racist things, mean things against immigrants, mean things against poor people, because of course we all know all poor people don't want to work. When I hear these things, I get defensive, and perhaps even I am showing the worst in my nature by becoming defensive. So we've seen the ugly side of both sides, whereas we feel that our voices have to be heard and we have to protest. There's always those instigators that create riots, whether it was one of them that started it or one of us that started it. The same thing happened in the Capitol. Perhaps these people, if I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, just wanted their feelings heard, although misled. They wanted them heard. And again, we know that there were those amongst the groups who went a little too far, a lot too far. I'm just giving them the benefit of the doubt. I'm trying to see things as they see things. But let's just face it. We've all been misbehaving. We're angry, we're hurt, and other people are just mean and ugly. What these last 4 years have shown is that it only takes one tyrant to give these bad people permission to misbehave, to storm our democracy, to threaten with lynches. If it was about democracy and getting their voice heard, we wouldn't have lynches, would we? Because lynches is very specific to a very ugly time. By seeing these people doing what they are doing, storming, and I know I hated going to McAllen during this whole campaign because of the Trump trains. It's great. You can fly your flag, but that Trump flag has become the Confederate flag. And it would bother me that my own people, and by my own people, I mean Mexican American Tejanos, those are my people, we're running around waving a Trump flag when Trump and his real people don't like us. Because no matter what, no matter how long we have been here, and we know that some of us have been here for hundreds of years, thank you very much, but in their eyes, we're not American. So joining their campaign made me angry and made me fussy and made me show the worst of my personality, which made our side look bad. I realize it. What I'm saying is there's a lot of ugliness going on. And this former president, whose name shall not be mentioned, gave people permission. They gave them permission to be mean, to be ugly, to bully others. And this didn't happen overnight. It took 4 years and a short campaign to give people permission to come out from under the rocks that they were hiding in. But this next generation, this generation of young millennials who we have spent so much time talking stuff about, they said it's not going to happen. And they protested. We protested. We said, no, it's not going to happen. And I got to be honest, and I'm speaking to the younger people in our audience, because those of us of a certain age and older don't need to be reminded. In the past, and even in my lifetime, we saw racism. We saw, even in the 80s, my family in New Braunfels was sat next to the kitchen in a restaurant. And my family were business people at the time. But our money was not as good as other people's money because we were still Mexican. In our lifetime, in my lifetime, we were told not to speak Spanish in school or we would get a paddle. In my father's lifetime, there was the Mexican water fountain. In my father's lifetime, he sat in the balcony because only white people got to sit at the bottom. And this is the Rio Grande Valley, where the majority of us are Mexican American, well, Mexican at the time, but now Mexican American. And all of the, let's say, white people, all the Anglo-Americans or whatever ethnicity, were from out of the valley. But still, we were lynched. We were beaten. And I say this because I was starting to feel that even my own children were forgetting the history. Even our own children, we wanted to protect them so much that we did not let them work the fields. We didn't pick cotton. We didn't pick tomatoes. And we don't know what it feels like to work for those little low wages. And I felt that this next generation forgot, and they took for granted all the liberties they had. But this past year, there was an awakening. I think that all of these horrible things that happened, all of the beatings of African-American men, the murders of African-American men, and the injustice we just saw in the Capitol, where a certain color of your skin allows you to even break into Congress without any ramifications. There were a couple ramifications. There was one that I know of, definitely, and that's too bad. I'm sorry it happened. But if the other side had done it, the other side, including white people too, because we know in our church that there are a lot of wonderful, loving, giving, white, I hate saying white, Americans who are there for justice. So we would have lost a lot of people. We would have lost a lot of our UUs if we had stormed that Capitol. And that is an injustice. And I think that our generation, the new generation, these young kids are seeing those injustices. And all of these injustices have planted a seed. And I think that it is opening up our eyes to saying, hell no. It has reawakened us to know who we are, where we came from, and that we have value. A seed of intolerance has been planted. This seed is one that hate is not acceptable. It's a seed that goodness will always overcome hatred, but it will take time. This didn't happen overnight. I know when I get sad and disillusioned about all this that's going on, I think of what a doctor once told me and said, hey, how long did it take you to get fat? And I'm like, oh, a long time. And he said, it's going to take double the time, and it's going to take hard work. And that's true with anything. We got to be patient, and we got to put the work in. It's going to take time, but we as a beloved community, we need to knead our bread, give it time, and savor it when it's ready. Meg ends with this thought. The poet said, "It is not the age of information. The people are hungry. We help one another rise. We say one good word, and it can become bread for 1,000. Blessed be."
Blessed be. Now we are going to have the offering chorus. Please join in singing our offering chorus, which you'll find